Ohtani stuns in first batting practice in 50 days. Some silences in baseball speak louder than any crowd ever could. Not the silence after a strikeout. Not the silence after a missed catch in the outfield with runners on base. Not even the silence that fills a stadium when a game-deciding play is being reviewed on replay and nobody in the building knows which way it is going to go. This was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of two experienced baseball men standing on a practice field on a quiet morning in Los Angeles, watching something happen in front of them that neither one of them had a word for. Two men who had spent their entire professional lives around the game. Two men who had seen every kind of athlete and every kind of talent and every kind of moment that this sport is capable of producing. Two men who thought they had already seen everything worth seeing. And then Shohei Ohtani stepped into the batting cage for the first time in 50 days. 50 days is a long time in baseball. It does not sound long when you say it out loud. 50 days. 6 weeks and change. A stretch of the calendar that passes quickly when you are watching from the outside. But inside a clubhouse, inside a training facility, inside the mind of a player who has not picked up a bat in competition or practice for that length of time, 50 days is an entirely different measurement. 50 days is rust. 50 days is timing that has to be rebuilt from scratch. 50 days is the slow, quiet erosion of something that took years to construct. The greatest hitters in the history of this sport have spoken about how quickly the feel of the bat in their hands can change after even a short absence. 10 days. 2 weeks. A month away from live pitching and the body starts to forget things the mind still remembers perfectly. 50 days. The Dodgers knew what they were dealing with. The coaching staff knew what they were dealing with. The training staff knew. The front office knew. Everyone in the building understood that what was about to happen in that batting cage was not a formality. It was not a routine check-in to see how the shoulder was feeling or whether the swing mechanics had held up in the absence of regular work. This was the moment of truth. This was the morning that would tell the Dodgers everything they needed to know about what the rest of their season was going to look like. Hitting coach Oyama Yada arrived at the facility before most of the other staff. That alone said something. Yada is not a man who performs concern. He is not a coach who shows up early to a batting practice session because appearances matter. He shows up early because the work matters. Because the details matter. Because in his experience, the difference between a player who comes back from a long absence stronger and a player who comes back diminished almost always lives in the preparation that happens before the first pitch of batting practice is ever thrown. He had his notes. He had his observations from the weeks of Ohtani's recovery. He had the mechanical checkpoints that he and Ohtani had discussed during the period when swinging a bat was not yet an option. He had a plan for what this morning was supposed to look like. What he did not have was a plan for what it actually looked like. Mark Pryor arrived a few minutes later. The pitching coach and the hitting coach stood together near the edge of the batting cage as the facility began to come to life around them. They exchanged a few words. The kind of words that two coaches exchange before an important moment when neither one of them wants to say out loud what they are actually thinking. The cautious optimism that exists in the space between hoping for something and being afraid to hope too loudly. Then Ohtani walked out. He didn't rush. That was the first thing both coaches noticed. Not the way he was carrying his bat. Not the way he was dressed or how his shoulder looked or whether there was any visible sign of discomfort in the way he moved across the practice field. The first thing they noticed was that he was not in a hurry. 50 days away from the batting cage and Shohei Ohtani walked toward it like he had all the time in the world. He went through his routine with the quiet methodical focus of a man who had been through this process 10,000 times and trusted it completely. The stretches. The warm-up swings. The slow, deliberate movement through the mechanics that live so deep in his muscle memory that no amount of time away can fully erase them. Yada watched every movement. Pryor watched every movement. Neither one spoke. This was not the moment for speaking. Then the first pitch came. The sound was immediate. Not the tentative crack of a player who is finding his timing again after a long absence. Not the slightly off contact that tells a hitting coach that the work is going to take longer than expected. Not the sound of rust. Not the sound of 50 days of inactivity catching up with the mechanics of one of the greatest hitters the sport has ever seen. The sound was clean. Loud. Certain. The ball jumped off the bat with the kind of authority that makes batting practice stop feeling like practice. The coaches on the field turned to look. The players who were nearby paused what they were doing. Because that sound does not happen by accident. That sound does not happen because a player showed up and got lucky on the first swing. That sound happens because something that was supposed to need rebuilding turned out to have never been broken at all. Yada did not move for a moment. He stood completely still with his notebook in his hand and watched the ball land and then looked back at the cage where Ohtani was already resetting for the next pitch. His expression did not immediately reveal what he was thinking. But the stillness revealed everything. Because Oyama Yada does not go still when he sees something expected. He goes still when he sees something that stops the calculations running in his head and forces him to start them over from the beginning. The next pitch came. Same result. Then the next. Then the next. By the time Ohtani had worked through the first round of batting practice, the silence around the cage had become its own kind of statement. Nobody was performing casualness. Nobody was pretending that what they were watching was routine. The players who had gathered without making it obvious that they were gathering stood with the quiet attention of people who understood that they were watching something worth watching. The coaches had stopped making notes. Not because there was nothing to note. Because some moments resist being reduced to bullet points on a clipboard. Pryor leaned slightly toward Yada. He said something low. Just a few words. The kind of words that don't need to be loud to land. Yada didn't respond immediately. He just kept watching the cage. Kept watching Ohtani move through his at-bats with the rhythm and precision of a player who had not been away for 50 days but who had somehow used those 50 days to arrive at a version of himself that was sharper than the one who left. When Yada finally turned to look at Pryor, his expression had shifted. It was not celebration. It was not relief. It was something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. It was the expression of a hitting coach who had prepared himself for the long road of bringing a player back and was now standing at the beginning of that road realizing it was significantly shorter than he had built himself up to walk. Pryor, for his part, said nothing. He had no words for what he was watching. And for a pitching coach who had spent his career finding the right language for the right moment, that speechlessness was its own kind of tribute. After the session ended, Yada spoke. Not to the media immediately. First to Ohtani. A brief exchange near the edge of the cage after the last pitch had been thrown and the equipment was being gathered and the morning was transitioning from the intensity of the session into the quieter rhythms of the rest of the day. Their conversation was short. It had the quality of a conversation between two people who do not need many words because the work has already said most of what needs to be said. Then Yada walked toward the reporters who had been granted access to the facility for the morning. He was asked directly, "What did you see out there today?" He took a breath. Not a dramatic breath. The breath of someone organizing thoughts that are not yet fully organized. Honestly, I came out here this morning prepared for a process. I had a plan for what the next few weeks of work were going to look like. And I think I need to go back and look at that plan again. Because what I saw in that cage today was not a player who needed 50 days to come back. What I saw was a player who used 50 days to arrive somewhere. He paused there. Let the words find their own weight. I don't say that lightly. I've worked with a lot of hitters. I've seen players come back from absences that were shorter than this one and need months to find themselves again. What Shohei showed today was something I genuinely was not prepared for. And I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. He was asked about Pryor's reaction specifically. About the moment when the pitching coach went quiet. Yada almost smiled. Mark has been around this game for a very long time. He has seen things. And when Mark Pryor stops talking, you pay attention. Because that doesn't happen often. He went quiet about 4 swings in and he stayed quiet for the rest of the session. I think that tells you everything. There are players who come back from injury. And then there are players who come back from injury and make you feel like the injury was something that happened to the calendar and not to them. Players who return to the field and immediately remind everyone watching that their talent does not live in the days and weeks they have been present. It lives somewhere deeper than that. Somewhere that rest cannot reach and absence cannot diminish. 50 days away from the batting cage. One session to silence every question that 50 days had created. Oyama Yada walked back toward the facility with his notebook under his arm and his plan for the next several weeks of Ohtani's return already becoming something that needed to be rewritten. Mark Pryor stood near the cage for a moment longer than everyone else. Looking at the spot where the balls had landed. Thinking something he had not yet found the words for. Some mornings in baseball answer questions you didn't even know you were asking. This was one of them.